Good morning, everyone. Hasidim have a custom that when they say l'chaim, it's not just over a little cup of wine, but it's over vodka. And someone explained once why Hasidim say l'chaim on vodka. Because vodka is the only liquid that when you put it into a freezer, everything around it becomes frozen, but the vodka remains fluid. And therefore, the message of saying l'chaim is that in life, we always have to keep our heart warm. We have to make sure that we never become cold or hardened or frozen, but we have to remain fluid with vitality, with feeling, with emotion. In this week's Torah portion, we read about Pharaoh who had a hard heart. And the first 7 plagues are in this week's Torah portion. And each time Moses comes to Pharaoh to ask him to let the Jews go, Pharaoh's heart becomes hardened and he refuses to let the Jews go. And even though he suffers plague after plague, his heart is not moved by the plea of Moses for the plight of the poor Jewish people who were being oppressed and who were suffering. Today is Martin Luther King Day. And Martin Luther King was Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. But it's interesting that it wasn't his doctorate that inspired him and motivated him to become the famous leader of the civil rights movement, which brought about such sweeping change for his community, for the African American community, and for our entire society. But it was the fact that he was a reverend, and he was well versed in the Old Testament. And all of his speeches quote the famous verses from Isaiah, from Amos, about justice and about righteousness. And in his last speech in Memphis, the night before he was assassinated, he quoted Moses at the end of his life, and he said to those in attendance, "I've climbed the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not make it to the promised land, but you will make it there." And of course, he was echoing Moses' last words before he died. And indeed, it was the life of Moses in this week's Torah portion, who stood up to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," which inspired the Reverend Martin Luther King to fight for justice and for freedom for his people. And so too, each and every one of us in our own lives have to be inspired by Moshe, by the Torah, to always stand up against injustice, to always speak out, to never allow the indifference of others to make us become cold or hardened, to lose feeling for the plight of others. There's a story told about a rabbi who was raising money for the poor people in the community who lacked heat in their homes and couldn't even afford firewood to warm their homes. And he was going from home to home. And he went to a particular wealthy person who was known to be miserly, who would not give generously. And the rabbi knocked on his door on a freezing cold night, and the rich man came to the door, and his teeth started chattering and his hands were shaking. And the rabbi said, "I'd like to speak to you." And he said, "Sure, come into my house. I'll be happy to talk to you, Rabbi." The rabbi said, "No, I need to speak to you right here." He says, "What do you need?" And he's shaking and cold. The rabbi said, "I came to raise money for the poor people in the community who can't afford basic firewood to warm and heat their homes. Will you make a donation?" And the man said, "Of course, Rabbi, I'll give you some money, but why are you insisting on speaking to me outside? Why aren't you coming to my house?" The rabbi said, "Because if we sit in your warm house sipping a hot tea, you won't be able to feel, you won't have the proper empathy for the plight of those who are sitting in freezing cold homes. I wanted you to stand outside and feel the bitter frost and the cold, so maybe you will be motivated to give more generously." Moses inspired Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King brought about a revolution in civil rights. This week's Torah portion should inspire each and every one of us that sometimes we stand up for justice, and like Moses, we face obstacles and challenges. We come across the hardened hearts, sometimes our own hardened heart, but with perseverance and persistence, ultimately, like Moses, we will break through and we will gain freedom for ourselves and for others. Have a wonderful day.